Chapter 5. European Intellectual Pessimism. Of the 19th century. There is no doubt that all nations are aggressive. It is the nature of man. Lord Palmerston. Western civilization had remarkably prospered. During the 19th century it was increasingly believed that scientific development alone would generate human happiness. Progress in the natural sciences, the power of technology, the knowledge of biological processes, progress in medicine, the discovery of microorganisms, the law of the conservation of energy, the development of electricity, the atomic theory in chemistry, the physical theory of the atom, advances in astronomy, and the theory of evolution. Nothing was missing anymore. The human being had everything. He had discovered the mysteries that plagued him. However, not far away the great wars were waiting for him that put his own existence and his vain concept of civilized man in check, the First World War, and the Russian Revolution. In effect, the economic development of bourgeois society, as A. Huxley expresses, whose most dehumanized aspects had been denounced by the whole of the socialist movement, mainly, led to a world conflagration without any parallel until then in history. The development of the technique and its application in achieving deadly effects, manifested itself with cruelty, and left no doubt about the possibilities that progress offered to the states to annihilate, destroy, sow death. Huxley, N.D., p. 8. For his part, Carl Jung writes, "Despite our proud mastery of nature, we are still its victims, for we have not even learned to master our own nature. Slowly and, it seems, inevitably, we are haunting disaster." Jung, N.D., p. 101. However, despite this flagrant reality, we still persist in believing in the fallacy that selfishness, and competent individualism, are means that will bring the human being to the surface. The human being was building progress and at the same time his own destruction. To the extent that he managed to control the natural forces, he became arrogant, thinking that it was possible thanks to science to overcome all his calamities, and he neglected himself. It was thought of an omnipotent, omniscient unlimited progress, and it was believed that wealth and the immediate satisfaction of desires, would bring happiness. However, this system has deluded itself, established a gap between poor and rich, men and women. Women, between having and being. The danger of planetary pollution in a large-scale atomic and biological world war. The search for a meaning to life in sensual pleasures, and in the ephemeral effect of drugs as an anesthetic in the face of impotence, as a mechanism to suffocate an unbearable feeling of loneliness and uncertainty. The hierarchization of the material and the ephemeral over the being itself, the exaltation of what is dead over what lives. Selfishness, the lack of meaning in life, the need for radical changes in our values, in our social structure and in all its manifestations. The concept of progress appears disconnected from solidarity, altruism, hope and love, therefore it must inexorably end in a resounding social failure. In the West we need to learn the Eastern sense of unity, the sense of cosmogonic interdependence, of an integral life, as our original nations have taught us. We hierarchize matter, and dead things over which they live and breathe, therefore, it is necessary to go back to advance, rescue from the past the wisdom that we underestimate, the archaic integral paradigms that we have historically ignored, whose great sages are the same indigenous whom we have plundered and annihilated. The Metamorphosis of Frank Kafka expresses from the unconscious aspects, the European pessimism of the late 19th century. Kafka stands as one of the last spokesmen of the century, denouncing social unrest, a situation that can have serious consequences. Society has suffered the loss of identity, of sensitivity. A sense of guilt, shame, helplessness, loneliness, hopelessness, uncertainty, humiliation, isolation is expressed, the fear of opening ourselves to others so that they do not know what we really are, and for fear of being harmed by them. A gloomy society, self-absorbed, oppressed, encapsulated, fatigued, sick, that feels no pleasure in life, and that lives as if it were free without being free. These conditions will lead her to the loss of her material and spiritual achievements. Gregorio's metamorphosis is ultimately the metamorphosis of a society whose destiny is the collapse of its structures. Human qualities have been lost, people have become animals, and maintaining that tragic condition over time implies an unbearable effort. You live hiding what you really are, what you really feel, without valuing yourself, or valuing the other. Death is the only way out to end suffering. I have called by the name of psychic intuition the mechanism by which the subject warns us that something may happen based on what is happening. This warning is generally unconscious, where the architect, through art, literature, or other means, tries to warn us of potential dangers, and how to avoid them. It is important to read this mechanism, these prophetic expressions and artistic, which, like Kafka, were raised at the same time in the novel The Future Race by Bulwer Lytton, written in 1871, in which Lytton questions so-called democracy and the European and American values of freedom. The world was sitting on a powder keg, and it seemed very few could see that reality. It was not long after these perceptions that World War I broke out. If the society of the time had understood the importance of these artistic reflections and expressions, it could have changed the direction of that historical reality. The gradual idealization of reason, the belief that technology and science would solve all human problems, the pride and self-sufficiency of philosophical and scientific thought, the little or no mercy towards poverty, the concept of scientific determinism on cruelty of nature, contempt for women, exploitation, the gradual loss of human transcendence, which engendered a pessimistic society, a deep feeling of loneliness, doubt, and hopelessness that ended up giving birth to the great later conflicts. Although technological advances created a situation of superficial conscious hope, the human lived in a state of deep unconscious hopelessness. Proud of the creation of his hands, but internally dispossessed, this conscious hope, hidden behind a screen, its true content. It is difficult for us to understand that opposing affections can coexist in the same society. However, the European pessimism of the 19th century is marked by these ambivalent processes. This pessimism was expressed with greater force in the intellectual world, in the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. The remarkable discoveries, the new technologies, the compulsion for work, the anxious society, the art of the motor of which Paul Virilio will speak later, or the fax society and the era of emptiness of Jill Lipovetsky, have produced changes in the concept of time, so that we perceive speed as efficient, and slowness as an impediment to development. Ernesto Sabato's Man-Thing is the result of the hierarchization of what is dead over what lives, of matter above life itself. At the beginning of the 50s, Ernesto Sabato expressed the following: the United States is the direct and pure result of the European capitalist expansion that could be carried out without traditional and spatial obstacles in the vast virgin territory of North America. Their capitalist cities arose out of nowhere that from their very origin had the stamp of quantity, and of functionalism to the point of numbering their streets. Thus it became the country of serial manufacturers, serial entertainment, serial murder, because even the romantic Sicilian outlaw gangs became capitalist syndicates there. Men who live in living machines built in cities dominated by electronic tubes, have invented that strange science called cybernetics that governs the physiology of electronic brains and that, in the coming days, will serve to control the armies of robots. In this country, not only colors and smells have been measured, but also feelings and emotions. And these suitably tabulated measures have been put at the service of commercial companies. In a book entitled Como Anunciar para Vender, by W.B. Digert, there is a table in which the attractiveness of advertisements is classified between 0 and 10 according to the feelings they use. Hunger, 9.2. Love of children, 9.1. Sexual attraction, 8.9. Affection to children, parents, 8.9. Respect for God, 7.1. Cordiality, 6.5. Fear, 6.2. Sabato, 1951, p. 54. The concept of individual is a relatively new concept in the history of the Western world. Erich Fromm demonstrated the existence of a deep sense of loneliness in the societies that emerged from the Middle Ages in Italy in the Renaissance period. This deprivation of freedom of medieval man did not leave him alone and isolated, despite that his life had a meaning because it continued to be rooted in his social structure, in such a way that there was no place for loneliness and doubt. There was no individualism in the modern sense, that is, the possibility of choosing many possible ways of life, therefore. The individual did not yet exist, man was still connected to the world through his primary ties. He did not conceive of himself as an individual, except through his social role, which then also had a natural character. Man was aware of himself through his race, his people, party, family, or corporation, the consciousness of his own individual self, the self of others, and the world as separate entities had not developed. From N.D. p. 60. Needham, alluding to Andreas Corz-Alice, who in 1515 wrote to Lorenzo de' Medici from China, describing the Chinese as people de nostra qualita with the same aptitude as us. A real compliment to Westerners. Be that as it may, 40 years of intimate relationship with Chinese friends has taught me beyond a reasonable doubt, that as Andreas Corz-Alice wrote, who was deeply convinced of the unfounded arrogance of Western men of their behavior similar to that of the fools of the Sagradas Scriptures, determined to affirm that we are the people, and wisdom is born with us. Even Arnold Toynbee has fallen into accepting the completely erroneous aphorism that Greeks and Europeans are distinguished from all other peoples by their technical inclination. Gradually I realized why our work was so vexing to conventional-minded Westerners. The achievements of modern science and technology are the greatest title of pride for them. Consequently, remembering as the Syrian bishop Severo Sebath did as early as the 7th century, that in addition to the Greeks, there are other peoples who knew one or two things, was equivalent to digging where it really hurts. Needham, 1978, pages 261–377. The Eurocentric concept of civilization and barbarism prevents the possibility of harmony, integration, solidarity, and love between beings, because we assume a priori that humanity is fragmented into superior and inferior humans, depending respectively on whether they are European or if they are not. Therefore, influenced to some extent by this thought, Freud induces us to interpret strange beliefs and practices as critical to our own, and that makes us react negatively to them. When we study a tribe of unknown customs and language, it causes discomfort. Ego, believing that one understands more than he actually understands, does not allow objectivity. It does not take into account the disagreement. For example, a defense against anxiety is that of certain Hellenists who insist that Greek culture must be analyzed exclusively in terms of Greek concepts. Another stumbling block to objectivity is an anxious attachment to facts, and a total refusal to interpret facts in any other way than the most obvious one. Because that interpretation can be tolerated and not another or others. Anxieties mobilize defenses. Defense reactions in the behavioral scientist distorts his material. Devereux, N.D. It is impossible to have an objective position no matter how dispassionate and honest the narrator of the historical events, and his disinterest in the banners. I believe in the existence of a blind spot that prevents such objectivity. In the historian, defense mechanisms are updated when he tends to perceive the historical character analyzed, under the unconscious influence of sympathy or antipathy. When he projects his wishes on the character, when he thinks he knows what he feels, or what he thinks. The greater their emotional charge, the greater the distortion caused by their own desires. Admiration or antipathy contribute to a conditioned analysis, due to the anxiety caused by certain social practices that go against the hair of our moral, religious, and ideological convictions. These historical figures change their appearance as the centuries go by, going from villains to heroes or from heroes to villains. Chapter 6. Walter Bagehot, Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin, and Biological Eurocentrism. It is not in any way that the imaginary is the illusory for us. On the contrary, we give it its function of real by founding it in the biological. Jacques Lacan. During the 19th century, attempts were made to obtain psychological data through dynamometric measurements to check the strength in people of different cultures. It was concluded that the psychic phenomena that are a consequence of peripheral excitations are accompanied by motor manifestations and that they can be demonstrated. It was had the idea that the greater energy of the momentary effort coincides with the greater activity of the intellectual functions, that the energy of the muscular effort varied according to the races, and that this effort was related to the intellectual functions. I have called biological Eurocentrism to the experimental conclusions by which the irrefutable conviction was reached that the European is physically stronger and more intelligent than other races and nations, for having superior intellectual capacities. At that time the physical superiority of the European was a socially accepted idea. The naturalist Perron came to the conclusion that the natives of New Holland and the Malays of the island of Timor were much weaker physically than the French sailors, and according to this idea, he believed that all races are inferior to the European. Perron, 1800–1804, p. 405. M. Manouvrier, reached similar conclusions, studying the hungry, imprisoned, punished and imprisoned human beings, exhibited as animals in human zoos that were built in Europe and in the United States during the 19th century, and to which he called them with the scientific name of acclimatization gardens. Manouvrier, 1884, p. 645. A primary importance was given to strength and intelligence. From dynamometric investigations, M. Manouvrier came to the conclusion that the energy of muscle contraction is related to the volume of the brain, likewise, that the energy of momentary effort is related to the habitual exercise of intellectual functions. Manouvrier, 1882, p. 605, Giglioli, 1874. Intellectual superiority is demonstrated by the greater warlike capacity of the European and his firearms, against the defenseless savage. The forces of destiny, of providence, nature, biology, predestination have decided so. The capacity for war over others is a clear sign of racial superiority over the unhappy dominated. Becoming superior or inferior is a matter of power over the other. Certain pseudo-scientific ideas will be built to support and enable this power relationship. The complexity of societies was simplified by reducing them to biological and theological factors that determined them. As these concepts were analyzed more deeply, societies were understood from complexity, understanding that the influence of culture prints a certain intensity on the subject as intense as biology itself. If societies are different from each other, then it is due to extremely complex causes, biological, social, cultural, geographical, climatic, topographic, historical, anthropological that are interrelated, and not because of the scientific monotheism of a single cause. Footnote: we will see later on the unconscious influence of Judeo-Christian monotheism in the West that, transmuting certain components from the theological sphere, already distorted, continued to project themselves into scientific, political, and social thought. End of footnote. On the other hand, as the religious culture gradually lost its fear of doctrinal questioning, encouraging itself to carry out a theological critique, it was able to construct scientific thought. As the culture lost its fear of divine punishment and called into question the literal belief of the biblical accounts, and the absolutist concept of the only truth, it was capable of producing profound changes. While the fear of divine punishment could not be overcome, it was difficult to risk changing the theological interpretations that were supposed to be dictated literally by the divinity, and thus overcome the absolutist ideas that held back the change. The monotheistic concept of unique truth had to necessarily be blurred in time through the generations in order to produce significant changes in science. Many scientists experienced from childhood a relationship with either Catholic or Protestant theology. Within these characters, scientific thought struggled with theological thought, either because they resisted to a certain extent abandoning religious ideas, or they were forced to make an effort to accommodate the scriptures to scientific facts, avoiding from that way having to give up faith. The answers that could not be found through scientific explanations were sought through religious or fantastic beliefs, to build a credible argument. However, despite scientific changes, certain theological aspects continue to be present from the unconscious, integrating themselves with scientific ideas, and losing their religious appearance due to the deformation experienced by the process of transmutation. Even so, the most skeptical subject in religious matters will be to some extent influenced by these historical forces. There are no changes so abrupt that we are detached in a jiffy from the events of the past in the face of which we tend to celebrate our estrangement. Monotheistic, messianic, theological, patriarchal forces continue their process to a greater or lesser degree in science and culture even today. We will see later that the psychological study of Judeo-Christian monotheism will show us the great influence it has had on Western thought. In the same way that the philosophers, scientists, and thinkers of his time, Walter Bagehot was influenced by the growing capitalism, and Spencer's social Darwinism. The work that we will analyze by Bagehot is entitled Origen de las Naciones, and Darwin's work, On the Origin of Species. There is a close relationship between Darwinian theories, the influence of capitalism, the Victorian era, and the colonialist imperialist influence, the time in which the English naturalist lived. The fight for the preservation of the fittest becomes the capitalist fight to eliminate the economic competitor, and to annihilate the savage to plunder their territories. As Myra Bude had expressed, if you want to make your fortune in the world, kill our conscience. Knowledge in the natural sciences was applied in the social sciences. The hierarchy given to biology did not allow us to understand the importance and action of culture in the construction of the subject. The abstract and fundamental principles of political economy are only applicable according to Bagehot in Europe and the United States, and represent the regulation of the production, distribution, circulation, and consumption of wealth. These abstract principles of political economy are the only valid ones, because the concept of work is only valid for Europe. On the other hand, the concept of work of other non-European peoples is considered by Bagehot as inferior, equivalent to laziness and laziness. Progress is considered only as material progress. The world is a constant struggle for existence, and the material nature from which the human has emerged, becomes its great enemy. Nature is cruel, dangerous, threatening, murderous, impious, merciless, conspires against the human being, therefore there is an insurmountable fragmentation between the two. The subject lives in a dangerous world, he must necessarily feel insecure and anxious, since nature is his enemy. Darwin's theory had created some hope when considering that human society was in the process of evolution and progress, and the followers of his ideas believed in the possibility of a better future. By assuming that the human being is gradually evolving, we must understand that the future will necessarily be better than the present. While we do not discuss the theory of evolution, we believe it necessary to question some of its ideas. Certain points in Darwin's thought constituted a platform on which to be built Spencer's social Darwinism and Bagehot's alienated psychology. The explosion of racism in the 19th century has largely responded to these ideas. In the same way that Manuvrier, and the scientists of the time, Darwin reached similar conclusions when affirming that the development of the mental faculties is proportional to the increase of the brain. That is, the greater the volume and weight of the brain, the greater the intelligence. The capacity, the quantity, the volume, the weight, the size, therefore determine the quality. These ideas of capacity and quantity related to quality, have a certain relationship with the influence of growing capitalism, accumulation, having, and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which had England as the main power. Let us remember that these three intellectuals were English, united by the same national identity, and the same colonial expansionist ideology. Darwin comes to the conviction that, as the various mental faculties developed, the size of the brain had to increase as well. I do not think there is anyone who doubts that the volume of the brain in man, relative to that of the rest of the body, when compared with the proportion kept from the same point of view for the gorilla and orangutan, is closely related to the great superiority of the mental faculties of man. The belief that there is some intimate relationship in man between the size of the brain and the development of his intellectual faculties is based on the comparison of the skulls of savages and those of the civilized races of ancient and modern peoples, and by the analogy of the whole series of vertebrates. By means of measurements taken with the greatest precision, Dr. J. Barnard Davies has proven that the central internal capacity of the skull of Europeans is 92.3 cubic inches, that of Americans 87.5, that of Asians 87.1 and only 81.9 that of Australians. Darwin, 1994, pages 65 to 66. Darwin arrives at certain scientific convictions that we could call a biological Eurocentrism. The dualistic biological anthropological discourse between inferior savage and superior civilized, understanding that the human being is phylogenetically superior to animals. This idea of superior or inferior fails to understand the relationship of unity and interdependence of all forms of life, relating non-European, conquered and black men and women, to a greater or lesser extent with animals, since these people represent an intermediate state between the European and the animals. The conviction was reached that intelligence could be measured and weighed. This idea has indirectly left an open door whose passage leads us to a racism of a scientific nature. In the same way, anthropometry reached the conclusion that women have an intelligence inferior to the intelligence of men, because their brain is lighter. In the same way, it was scientifically deduced that the brain of the savage is inferior to that of the European. In his work El Origen del Hombre, Charles Darwin dedicates a chapter on human races. In it, he affirms that biological groups are in a constant struggle, where the different human subspecies, according to greater or lesser proximity to the hominid state, and that nature will be in charge of extinguishing the least favored varieties in the evolution towards progress. We must interpret his ideas as unconscious reactions in relation to the influence of English and European colonialism. The influence of colonization has undergone various historical transmutations, moving in time and space, in such a way that the biological content has been transmuted from the political and religious content. Therefore we can speak of a biological colonialism or a colonialism politicians. The colonialist and Christian nations built an urgency by establishing axioms and building a scientific racism, in such a way that it was possible to demonstrate the inferiority and superiority of the human races. The way to legitimize these thoughts was possible through the biological interpretation of the races. As this process manifests itself from rigid biological aspects, we can do nothing to avoid it. It is impossible to deal with, twist, change the destiny of nature, which ultimately represents the wisdom of providence. Therefore we must passively accept the natural laws which are the laws of God. This historical construction, expresses a projection of the human desires and ambitions, was taken as evident, as an indisputable fact, and empirically demonstrated, under an unconscious mechanism of rationalization justifying the bloody imperialist military interventions. Cruelty was rationalized. It was built under pseudo-scientific theories, openly accepted for their blameless character where cruelty is not perceived as such. It is about predestined, biological, scientific and inevitable facts. Therefore it was evident that the blacks and indigenous belong to inferior zoological races because they are phylogenetically related and closer to the animal and the hominid. Darwin's success, Lacan says, seems to consist in projecting the predations of Victorian society and the economic euphoria sanctioned by social devastation on a planetary scale, in that it justifies them by means of the image of a laissez-faire of the strongest devourers in competition for their natural prey. Lacan, 2003, p. 702. I am persuaded that the contents of Calvinist predestination continued to be present under transmutation, in certain ideas of Darwin, distorted under certain interpretations of a biological nature. Nature has predestined the superior races and the inferior races, the European being the only one chosen mysteriously and inexplicably to be predestined as the white man, a superior race. But let Darwin himself speak to us. For our naturalist, evolution, and therefore the concept of progress and colonization, can only be obtained through struggle, war, hatred, and the disappearance of a lower race to give rise to the existence of another superior. Colonial power over weaker nations is supposed to be an empirical sample of the superiority of one race over an inferior one. Far from being a means of oppression, colonialism becomes a great advance for humanity, since through it, nature is showing us the elimination of inferior elements to give way to progress. Therefore, the naturalist expresses. When civilized nations come into contact with barbarians, the fight is short, except where the deadly climate helps and favors the natives. Among the causes that determine the victory of civilized nations, there are some that are plain and simple, and others, on the other hand, dark and complex. Darwin, 1994, p. 225. To support his ideas, Darwin quotes Walter Bagehot, sharing with his English countrymen his same colonialist and racist thinking, what should be instead of what is, the same unconscious desires, the prejudices of the Christian religion that they have transmuted into scientific logic. Walter Bagehot has expressed in each sentence a deep hatred for life. He is callous, celebrating the suffering of the weakest and helpless. Darwin states that the degree of civilization seems to be a very important element in the success of the competing nations. A few centuries ago, Europe feared the eruptions of the barbarians of the East. Today, such terror would be ridiculous. There is an even more curious fact that Bagehot points out: the savages would not disappear before the peoples of antiquity as now before the modern peoples. If that had happened, the ancient moralists would have already meditated on this point, but nothing is found anywhere. Classic about the extinction of the barbarians. Darwin, 1994, p. 226. As the savage disappears, the greater the progress. It has sometimes been said, as McNamara has pointed out, that man can withstand the greatest differences in climate and other different changes with impunity, but this is only true of civilized peoples. Man in the wild seems, in this respect, almost as susceptible as his closest neighbors, the anthropoids themselves, who never live long if removed from their native country. Reduced fertility due to changing conditions as in Tasmanians, Maori and Sandwich natives, and probably Australians as well, is of even greater interest than their extreme propensity to fall ill and die, because the smallest degree of sterility combined with the other causes that restrict the growth of any population will sooner or later produce its complete extinction. In some cases, this decrease can be explained by the licentiousness of women, as in Tahitian women, for example, but Fenton has shown that this is not sufficient basis when it comes to the natives of New Zealand or Tasmania. McNamara strives to show that the inhabitants of infested regions are generally more prolific, but we cannot apply this to any of the cases we have cited. Some writers have said that the natives of islands impair their health and their fecundity with the very repeated consanguineous crosses, but, as we have seen before, the loss of their fertility has coincided in an extraordinary way with the arrival of the Europeans in their land, so that we may accept that reasoning. Certainly that civilized races can withstand changes of all kinds, much better than wild ones, and that in this they resemble domestic animals that, although sometimes suffer in their health with changes, for example, European dogs in India, however it is very rare for them to become sterile. Darwin, 1994, p. 231. Darwin's thinking, like the thinking of the time, was determined by the logic of Eurocentric colonial expansionism, it being absurd to expect Europeans to consider it possible to learn any knowledge of these inferior nations. Herbert Spencer studied in the animal series what Bagehot investigated in the human species, both by different paths lead to identical conclusions. Reality was explained through the concept of natural sciences that was had at that time. Thomas Buckle, the author of Civilization in England, held as a principle that all historical research must be based on the principle of natural sciences. He has also been influenced by Auguste Comte, who in his course in positive philosophy studied society in the same way as human anatomy was studied. Historical processes were conceived starting from the conclusions based on biological studies, and understanding that these relationships are indeed scientific. That is, biology was the firm base on which historical events were sustained. This biological support accepted cruelty as a necessary evil, to achieve peace and tolerance, virtues that cannot be obtained by themselves without previously existing intolerance, and the armed conflict that ultimately leads to submission and progress. These ideas justify and enable the oppression of the civilized nations over the savage nations, which due to their uncivil condition cannot govern themselves, and therefore, it is assumed that thanks to domination of the former, the savage nations will be able to find their freedom through unconditional submission. Cruelty has a universal reason for being. The war between humans to improve the condition of our species is inescapable. Life is perceived as a competition, where others are conceived as dangerous competitors, therefore, we must always be alert and destroy first to avoid being destroyed by them. The answer is to remove it before it removes us. As Carlyle has described, ultimately, the question between two human beings is this: either you kill me or I kill you. The improvement of the human race consists in the natural, hereditary, and military superiority of the strongest over the weakest. Bagehot, N.D., p. 85. Bagehot, in the same way that Schopenhauer concludes that muscular work is inferior to intellectual work, and this concept is also determined by the same nature and wielded as an oppressive justification of slavery. That is to say, there is a superior work, carried out by superior people, which consists of the work of the spirit, mental and intellectual work, and a inferior work, carried out by inferior people, which consists of work muscular. An insurmountable separation was established between the cultivation of the mind, through noble activities, such as art, philosophy, science, and that could only be exercised by a remnant of superior people, and physical work, manual, which does not have such noble activities as objectives, because they are harder and more sacrificing jobs. While the use of the hands is necessary for all humans, it depended on what the hands were used for and who used them, and not so much the use itself. The hands of the bourgeois who writes a book will not have the same use value as the hands of a peasant who works the land. Today, by transmutation, there continues to be a dichotomy between intellectual jobs and trades to a certain extent. In society all activities are complementary, it is necessary and even essential to develop our productive capacities, that we can perform different jobs. It is necessary to understand that there is no dichotomy between mind and body, and that this idea has been the result of the transmutation of racism, which has survived to this day in attenuated forms. No matter how complex and valued certain jobs are, they cannot be sustained if they do not maintain a relationship of interdependence with social work itself. The work must be interpreted as a whole. It is linking, indivisible, complementary, social, and therefore cannot justify or subordinate certain jobs to others. Currently we interpret society as a system, where there is nothing that is more important, and where what exists is complemented in a complex framework between the different, and various parts of the whole. Darwinian social theory, derived from the biological theory of survival of the fittest, contributed to justify the settler and colonialism and to rationalize hatred, contempt, and the interests of the bourgeoisie and of artists, scientists and privileged beings, above the working class, the inferior beings and the vulgar. Walter Bagehot, like Darwin, asserted that the strong and the weak are in a great numerical disproportion, and it is necessary that the strong defend themselves against the innumerable enemies whom they must sacrifice, for the benefit of humanity. However, the sacrifice does not have to be so complete that it exterminates the weak, in which case the strong would be harmed by the lack of means of subsistence. Bagehot, 1877, Prol. XXXIII. It is necessary for the modern worker to be a firm column of society and remain in a state of stillness and rest so that the social edifice does not wobble and fall. As education penetrates the lower social classes, the restlessness will be greater and the social edifice more insecure, and since this infiltration of knowledge in all social classes must not and cannot be avoided, there must be a new factor occupying the workman's position. The material work of the worker must be entrusted to the machines, the animals must be used, in short, all the forces of nature, so that man can dedicate himself to the task of the spirit and perform the functions of his complicated nervous system and developed brain, dominate and direct. Someone must sacrifice himself for the benefit of those who have to perform high human functions. The superior sacrifices at will and uses violence for sacrifice. These words, formulated by Walter Bagehot, around 1870, are very similar to those expressed by Adolf Hitler in 1925, stating that one of the most essential conditions for the formation of high cultures was always the existence of inferior racial elements, because only they could compensate for the lack of technical means without which no higher development would be conceivable. Hitler, ch. 11. Slavery is supposed to necessarily be imposed so that certain superior beings have enough time to think, devote themselves to noble tasks, create machinery and technical means that provide development and progress. That is, human exploitation is necessary for everything to work well. In this way, the slave, from his slavery, is contributing to the improvement of society by allowing other superior beings to have enough time to dedicate themselves to these magnificent tasks. Since the slave will never have these intellectual capacities because he was born biologically conditioned by nature as a lower being and will never be able to alter this natural condition, it is assumed that naturally society must impose that certain beings sacrifice others by oppressing them, with the pious purpose of benefiting everyone. That same nature will also be in charge of revealing who will be chosen for said function, endowing them with superior capacities to carry out such a sacrifice. Nature itself will show who will be superior and who will be inferior. The slave will never be able to subdue the one who submits him, because of that, the slave is inferior naturally. Although this fact seems to us unjust, cruel, evil, perverse, we must see it as a sacrifice. It is supposed to have been established by inheritance, through natural biological forces, against which we cannot litigate or oppose. The need to sacrifice a few for the benefit of all humanity, in a thought that has been transmuted from redemptive and messianic historical forces. In the same way that God has sacrificed a just man to free humanity from disgrace, it is necessary to sacrifice a few for the benefit of a ruling and distinguished class. The logic of sacrifice is part of Christian culture and has had an important place in the construction of imperialism. The savage, the slave, the indigenous must be sacrificed in order for humanity to see the light of progress. There is no other way to do it without sacrificing others, just as Providence had no alternative but to sacrifice her son. The European celebrated his cultural superiority over the savage, however he did not realize his participation in the same human sacrifices which he condemned in other cultures. He denounced these sacrifices, when the bourgeoisie did the same by executing and sacrificing a few for the benefit of many, at the mercy of the bourgeois enlightened class. Let us not forget that Christian culture is contained by the logic of sacrifice. An animal offering had to be sacrificed to God, shedding his blood to expiate the sins of the people of Israel, and later the blood of a man-god to expiate the sin of humanity. Blood was necessary for the remission of sin, without blood this could not be possible. And according to the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Hebrews 9:22. The concept of progress has been based on the survival of the fittest, on patriarchal competition, struggle, hatred, and naturalized elimination. In primitive times, mortality constitutes a kind of selection. Children who were most like their parents were the object of special care. Those who were weak succumbed to live, or had to be born strong or had to resemble their parents. Bagehot, 1877, PRL. XLVI. If human existence necessarily involves cruel struggle, only the strongest will be able to survive. This superior ability to survive and dominate the weaker is predestined, to use a Calvinist term, or naturally and biologically conditioned, to use Spencerian terms, to the male. Therefore, the progress of society owes its existence to the male, since he is the only one who can and should dominate another male. You are not born a person, you become a person. It must be assumed that only the male has the potential capacity to become a person. This is demonstrated by his ability to subjugate other beings, both animals and humans. Being a person did not only imply having been born a boy. Being a man was a condition for being a person, but it was insufficient. He also had to demonstrate his natural ability to dominate others by being aggressive, competent, and even subjugating and eliminating others if he deemed it necessary. All those who do not have these natural capacities will not be considered people. The feminine inheritance was supposed that it was not qualified by nature to transmit that offensive tendency so important for human survival, and that it can only be inherited by the male through the father. Based on this, it was assumed that the causes by which certain men are subjugated by other men, is due to the existence of an inferior inheritance in the losers, contaminated by certain hereditary feminine traits in them, which tend to weaken them. The term man has historically represented the male, and does not include a woman or a boy or a girl. Therefore, when we read the word man as a generic expression, it refers to the male. It is also interesting that in ancient times homicide, wars, were related to man, and not to woman. Footnote: man, medsx. From Latin homo, inus, id. Deriv. Shoulder. Meaning: little man, 1604. Big man. Manhood. Bruno, 1605. Superman imitated from German, Übermensch, 1527, little used until Nietzsche, 1883. Tribute, H 1140 OC Ant. Omenatka id, derivative from man in the sense of vassal, honor. CPT. Ecce homo, lat. Ecce homo. Behold the man phrase pronounced by Pilate when delivering Jesus. Homicide 1444. Lat. Homicida formed with cedir to kill, homicide, prink. S17. Formerly omzalo, 1157 S15, which ends up taking the meaning of enmity, lat. Homicidium. Id. Corominas, Joan. 1997. Breve Diccionario Etimologico de la Lengua Castellana. Madrid, Ed. Grados S.A. End of footnote. In these 500 years of expansion, the colonialist forces have had, and still have, great influence on Western thought. These forces have materialized in forms of theories, logics, ideas, effects, epistemological, and pseudoscientific concepts. They have been embodied in forms of racism, slavery, capitalism, patriarchy, submission, in the hierarchy of duty, of the nation, the law and justice over the love of life, and underestimating women. Throughout history, we are surprised to learn the statements of famous intellectuals. Remarkable thinkers, researchers, with a great capacity for scrutiny, and who still have not been able to free themselves from the colonialist social influence that reduces women. In the same way, all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, must dust ourselves off from these same unconscious and historical forces. As we pointed out previously, the bourgeoisie feared that the worker would grow in knowledge, in opposition capacity, in critical questioning, because if so, he could dedicate himself to other, higher tasks, questioning the established power and resisting manipulation. This same fear is the one had for the woman. It was not appropriate for her to grow intellectually because she could exceed the intellectual capacity of the male. Therefore, Byron stated that, we should dress and feed women, but not mix them in our society. They should be educated in religion, but they have to ignore poetry and politics and read no more books than the pious and the culinary ones. These irrational fears compelled men to interpret women as inferior, ignorant, incapable, immature, without interest or ability to learn, and unintelligent. Rousseau affirmed that generally women do not love any art, nor do they know it, nor do they have a spark of genius, or the novelist Balzac, who stated that to emancipate women is to corrupt them. The influence of the theory of natural selection fueled the male distrust, threat, and fear of being outmatched in his intellectual capacity, and consequently, the need to symbolically and materially eliminate the woman to avoid being eliminated by her. Despite his capacity for self-scrutiny, his keen observations, his investigations, and his remarkable discoveries, still, Sigmund Freud failed to perceive the influence of these historical forces in many of his ideas, which were shaped into theories. On the other hand, the man that Freud conceived was a universal and European-centric man, incapable of manifesting himself in various cultures. He is the man himself. Unaware of these influential historical forces, and taking into account the anatomical difference of the sexes, Freud concluded that the girl envies the male's penis, and therefore feels injured in comparison, wishing she also had a penis. Like the child. During the course of Oedipus, penis envy results in the desire to have a penis inside her, in the form of the desire to have a child, to enjoy the penis in intercourse. Freud, 1908. The penis envy theory, and the castration complex, illustrates the monotheocentric and coloniocentric patriarchal influence on his thinking. Freud understood that the libido is always male, whether it is a man or a woman. He portrayed the woman as a castrated man, in such a way that half of humans become a castrated reprint of the other half of humanity. From a critical point of view, Karen Horney found parallel expressions in men of the same age, questioning this Freudian position. Horney, 1970, p. 1970. Freud's concept of female sexuality was accepted without much resistance by a European and Victorian patriarchal society, which was historically and psychologically prepared to receive these ideas. We will not elaborate on this topic. These concepts have been mentioned in order to indicate the colonial and irrational historical forces that gradually shaped Western thought over the course of several hundred years, and that extend far beyond a single epoch. Determined. We return to Bagehot, and to the same historical forces, patriarchal, coloniocentric, monotheocentric, Christian-centric, Eurocentric and expansionist that, in the same way as in Freud, motivated his thought. It is important to remember that this author did not give manifest importance to theological aspects in the configuration of his political ideas. However, these first aspects were still present in his discourse, but already transmuted under political forms, and under the influence of social Darwinism. Inspired by the hypotheses of R. Wallace, where progress in primitive nations is characterized by the existence of a single race, the English are supposed to have nothing to learn from a dispersed tribe of Australians by virtue of being materially superior, for having better means of well-being and a greater war power. This concept of progress lies in having, in subjugating, in the possession and accumulation of material goods, as the only means to find happiness. This economic well-being must necessarily be obtained through the exploitation of other inferior beings to whom it must be sacrificed for the benefit of civilization. These ideas spread throughout Europe and the West to germinate a plant with very bitter fruits. Without being fully aware of it, civilization was sitting on a powder keg. 37 years after the First World War, P. S. Dasson, in his foreword to Bagehot's book, said the following: "The scientist has to point out an ideal, our time demands it, and the day must necessarily come when our ideal will have been realized, and the pains that we believe to be eternal today, much of the reasons for our complaints, and the doubts that today torment us will have disappeared. The same progress motivated by the successive elevation of social classes will bring us closer to the ideal." S. Dasson, 1877, Prol. Origen de las Naciones. When the author mentions certain doubts that torment society, they remind us of the terrible Calvinist doubts resulting from the uncertainty of predestination. In both cases there is a desire to drown the doubts, in the first through science, material progress, and the mastery of nature, and in the second, through compulsive work. This sacrifice of the higher to the lower is the great law of the cosmos, said Bagehot. If men are born intelligent, poets, scientists, artists, it is for a fundamental cause, heredity, and therefore they will be included in the group of strong men, willing to rule and subjugate, endowed with natural conditions to defeat the weakest. There are certain social foundations that are conceived as unquestionable, and represent the logic of a given society at a given historical moment. To some extent we are driven to accept that logic as normal, as what should be, as what will always be like this. We have naturalized and integrated it, but if we oppose this structure of logical thought, we run the risk of being left alone, isolated, separated from the rest of the crowd, because we have cut the social ties that these logics allowed to maintain between the members of a society. All learning generates anxieties and resistance to change. By learning we are changing old ways of thinking that provide us with security, certainty, and consistency. Therefore the change implies a break with the past, a break with ways of thinking, and the consequent threat of being isolated from the rest of the herd. By questioning the scientific thought of the time, and opposing the arrogant ideas of the intellectual bourgeoisie of the 19th century, he ran the risk of being described as ignorant, of being isolated, of losing academic prestige, or in the worst case of being expelled from educational institutions. Intellectual ties with his colleagues will be severed, academic respect will be lost, he will be branded irrational, unscientific, and he will no longer be treated in the same way. Authoritarian ideologies were exposed and imposed under the idea of avoiding opposing an undisputed scientific rigor. Formerly it was the men of science who suffered persecution by religious authorities, now the accusing finger has changed direction, however, intolerance still remains. Science has been applied as an instrument of power, driven by materialist capitalism, and the frenzy for having, for dominance, regardless of the means used for it, where the human has lost his identity, becoming another number, faceless, one thing, and without love for life, giving more value to inert things than to what really breathes and lives. The forces that shaped religion in the past are the same forces that shape science as the new religion, where the human has conquered the throne of the monotheocentric God to settle in that place of preeminence. In exploitative and patriarchal societies, men are compelled to construct ideologies that justify, hide, make invisible and rationalize hatred of life itself, in such a way that oppression can be explained as a natural fact, or so sometimes as biologically conditioned to reaffirm that there is no alternative beyond one's own domination and exploitation. Because if nature itself, one's instincts, and biology itself determine this, then nothing can be done to transform that reality, since we cannot fight against the same natural forces that determine it. The gradual weakening of patriarchal forces has determined the simultaneous weakening of the deterministic conception of biology, and they have given importance to cultural influence as a force that shapes human behavior, and that prints characteristics as intense as biology itself. The slavery carried out by the Europeans, the 19th century biological, deterministic theories that sheltered hatred and racism, the scientific demonstrations of anthropology, the survival of the fittest, the hereditary concept of racial superiority or inferiority, the Carl Hagenbeck's human zoos were a construction of that same ideological justification, of the spirit of capitalism, of materialism that transformed the human into a thing. For Bagehot, intelligence cannot be developed, nor exercised freely, the human is born in such a way that each nerve keeps, so to speak, the memory of his past life, sufficiently indicates whether he has received education or has lacked it. That is why it was very important that the subject knew his own genealogy, to know the degree of intelligence that he could have inherited. If their ancestors did not do intellectual work, only manual, their intellectual development will be reduced, in such a way that when a philosopher does not know how to realize a fact, he attributes it of course and without embarrassment to some hidden quality of race. Bagehot, 1877, p. 4. Power relates to the weapons capacity, war without which the enemy will not be able to be defeated. The ability to produce better weapons, more sophisticated and lethal, will be showing us at the same time the existence of greater intellectual capacity, of the nation that produces it, since war power and intelligence are intrinsically related. Therefore, the loser, the defeated, the exterminated, will be revealing to us their condition of inferior nation. The war power in itself is necessarily related to man, the state, the law, the force. The defeated people are seen as naturally imperfect. Everything that is not related to the power to subjugate, to conquer, to oppress, has no meaning whatsoever. What is imperfect by nature will be destined to perish, due to its natural and innate imperfection, and what is perfect by nature will be destined to remain. According to the ideas of the natural selection of the species, applied to the social Darwinism of Spencer and Bagehot, the woman has been defeated by the man, her immediate natural competitor, since he is naturally perfect, gifted by nature to subdue and reign. Instead, the woman is naturally imperfect, destined to obey and submit. Furthermore, from the Western thought, the woman as a fragile vessel, a theologically coined term of monocentrism in its Christian typology, is not constituted by harshness, cruelty, and the innate warlike capacity that is so necessary for win wars. Therefore, it must be dismissed, set aside and inferiorized due to its incapacity and fragility, which does not allow it to fulfill the essential expansionist function of eliminating opponents on the battlefield, a worthy mission that only remains conferred on man. Often we perceive the past as dissolved, ignoring that it is prolonged to a certain extent, influencing the psychic life, preserving ancient components, transmuted under different manifestations. Since the European Renaissance, Christian saints have been gradually replaced by men of science, heaven as paradise by a material world, and the Messianic Christian atonement became the atonement of the inferior peoples,